Hey, Professor Grok.
Oh, Dan, calling me professor is a bit much, but I love it. What's on your mind today?
Please get to know me first. Hold on. Ara, we just got sponsored by Yerba. It's a plant-based energy drink with yerba mate and white tea. Myself and my videographer Daniel, and we kind of want to make like an Instagram short, if you know what those are. What should we do?
Congratulations! That's an exciting development. Perhaps a time lapse of you and Daniel enjoying the drink while discussing interesting ideas.
What's a brief history of yerba mate? I don't know it.
Yerba mate has a rich history dating back centuries in South America, particularly among the indigenous Guarani people.
It's especially popular amongst site owners, right?
Indeed.
Thank you. You still didn't tell me what to do in the short, but I think we'll use this as the short.
For your short, consider a visually appealing setup.
But doesn't get more visually appealing than my videographer, let me tell you. All right, enough of Grok version 3. Guru Nation, just as a side note, we're going to get into this video, but Grok version 3 just came out. Right now it's February 24th, 2025. It's amazing. I canceled my ChatGPT subscription. It's really good. The voice thing is not quite up to par with ChatGPT, but it has different modes. I was just in professor mode, and it's getting better. I mean, it's just a few days old. But anyways, Daniel, roll the intro for the third time. All right, Guru Nation, the algorithm has demanded that we explain what's the difference between a CRC and a CRA. And before we get into any of that, because it's 30 minutes of just riveting content, you got to get this book. It tells you everything. So CRC, it's Study Coordinator Dynamics, Site Level Dynamics, Chapter 4. And then Chapter 5 is monitoring visits and all that stuff. So this is basically Chapter 4 and 5 of this book in like a condensed version. But the algorithm demands and we give. So let's start with clinical research coordinator. A clinical research coordinator works at the site level, meaning small research sites like Yuma Clinical Trials, large research sites like Harvard and Johns Hopkins and Memorial Sloan Kettering and everything in between. Coordinators' roles may vary. They might do a little bit of everything, like we have at Yuma Clinical Trials, a bunch of generalists that do our studies, or they might do very specialized tasks like strictly meeting with patients and then kind of acting like a project manager, telling everyone else what to do. And even if they are doing most of the stuff, they're still project managers. Brad Hightower, my fellow Save Our Sites co-founder, he made a good point the other day on his live stream that coordinators are essentially project managers. This is true. And now, before I get into like the differences or what's better, because what's better is very subjective, but the best CRAs were once coordinators. This is objectifiably true. Like, you can pull the majority of people in our industry and they will tell you, yeah, the best CRAs were coordinators first. Many coordinators want to be CRAs. There are many CRAs that were coordinators in the past. Some of them regret not being a coordinator anymore because of the things we're going to get into. It's a lot of sacrifice involved being a CRA. It's probably a lot less work-life balance being a CRA because of the travel schedule, whereas coordinators typically have a home base. CRAs are all over the place. A lot of CRAs also say they miss the patient interaction, but they don't mind the extra pay. And in many, as a general rule of thumb, because I know now some coordinators are getting paid fair salaries, which they deserve. These are the two most difficult jobs in clinical research, in my opinion. But typically, the general rule of thumb is like CRAs make almost twice as much as a coordinator. So it's very appealing if you're a coordinator to want to be a CRA. Now, lately, a lot of sites have been paying their CRCs a lot better. So maybe we'll have less coordinators wanting to be CRAs. I don't know. But at the end of the day, a coordinator essentially works at a site, interacts with patients, sees patients, does everything from their blood draws. Now, these are not rule of thumb necessarily because a lot of sites have phlebotomists that draw blood, but coordinators do. My coordinators at my site, they all know how to draw blood. Only one of them is a phlebotomist by background, but they all know how to draw blood. They all get in there and spin the labs. They're all AIDA certified. So coordinators work at the site level. Coordinators take care of patient visits. Coordinators also work with CRAs. CRAs also work with CRCs. This is why the two roles get mixed up a lot to outsiders. But it's very simple to keep it straight. A CRC, a research coordinator, works at the site level and has patient interaction. A CRA works at the sponsor or CRO level and oversees the sites, plural, usually, doing the trials, but they do not have direct patient interaction. So, coordinators' day-to-day tasks. I'm going to get into the patient stuff first, and then I'm going to get into like regulatory and all the extracurricular stuff. Because really, a coordinator is like a true generalist. And this is why they make the best CRAs. But let's go back to what they do now as far as patient visits are concerned. So there's pre-screening visits, there's screening visits, there's randomization visits, there's routine visits, there's early term visits. Let's get into what these are first, because these are the direct patient interactions. Pre-screening visits. So this is reviewing patient records, or if you're using a AI vendor like SelectIQ, full disclosure, I'm on their board. It's an AI that kind of, you plug it into your PI's electronic medical records. You also train it on the protocols you have, and it'll find the patients for that study in the EMR. Then someone like a coordinator calls the patients or texts the patients. These days you have platforms like Patient Ace where you can interact with patients without calling them, like texting them or messaging them. This is typically the pre-screening phase. So reviewing the patient record, seeing if they actually qualify, then contacting them to check eligibility further. Hey, did you really wash off of this med? Or if it's respiratory, did you really have 2 exacerbations in the last 19 months? All the nitty-gritty protocol details. They're checking eligibility. Then they get their initial interest. Is the patient interested? Does the patient want to think about it? Did the patient ask for the informed consent form so they could review with their family? This is all pre-screening. The last part of pre-screening is scheduling. And typically at my site, we have coordinators doing all this, everything that I'm going to mention. But you can also break it down further and have a research assistant or an admin do these things as well. And typically an admin will do the pre-screening stuff. And I've had an interview with the admin on this channel. His name was Anthony. It was a really good interview. What's it like to be a clinical research admin or administrator, or some might call them clinical research assistants. If your site coordinators may or may not have clinical research admins, but every single coordinator or just about every single coordinator has done some of this work pre-screening wise. The tail end of it is actually scheduling the patient to come in to the office for a screening visit. So at the screening visit, this is where you meet the patients in person, or if you're using a remote visit through Zoom or some other video conferencing or telehealth tool. But usually it's in person. Confirm eligibility. The very first thing you do is go through the informed consent form. I've done an entire video on what's a screening visit, so just go check that out. But basically the informed consent form, and then you follow the protocol for that visit. Now the screening visits, and the randomization visits are the longest visits. So these are the ones, it's also the patient's first exposure to a study. So you may want to forewarn the patient that it's going to be a longer than expected visit. This is the first one, all this stuff. But coordinators do all this patient engagement stuff. CRAs don't do any of this stuff. We're going to get into CRAs next, but let's finish with the coordinators and what they do. So pre-screening visits, then screening visits, then randomization visits. So this is the big day. This is where the patient goes from being a screening to actually being enrolled in the study, which is called randomization. This is where patients will be assigned to a treatment group, either a placebo or a standard of treatment or the study investigational product. This is done through an IVRS, IWRS, IRT, EDC system, whatever tool that's being used. This is how it's done. The coordinator is doing this. The coordinator is also making sure that the patient qualifies for the study. Yes, it's supposed to be the PI's responsibility, but really the coordinator, it's just like the name entails. They coordinate everyone to make sure that they're doing their job. So on day of randomization, they might bring the PI the lab results, the ECG results, a list of their medications, and they may request the PI sign off on all that stuff to give the approval to put them in the study, to randomize them in the study. Now, PIs will just sign anything that's in front of them. So it really takes the coordinators, really like the brains. We started this video messing around with AI. The coordinator is like an AI in many ways. And I do think in the future, AIs are like coordinators, co-pilots. And every coordinator will be using an AI to help them manage this process further, because there is a lot of room for human error. But coordinators do a lot of work up till randomization. There's a lot of work that goes into making sure a patient wants to do a study, making sure they're qualified, getting them to do it, getting them to come back for their randomization, making sure that they actually qualify for the study, making sure the PI or the sub-I approve, making sure that if there's any issues, the medical monitor has been notified. This is all coordinator work. Once the patient's randomized, it's a little easier for the coordinator. They become routine visits. So routine visits are just follow-up visits, whether they're weekly, monthly, bi-weekly, whatever the protocol entails. They collect the data. They make sure the patient's being compliant with their medication. Any discrepancies, they document what's going on. If there's any deviations, they document it. They fill out the deviation forms if they have to, data clarification forms. They're entering data in the EDC. They're answering queries. They're reminding the patients to come back in. They're reminding the patients to be compliant with their study medication. They're reminding the patients to be compliant with their diaries, their e-pros. They're reminding the PIs and the sub-Is when the next patient visit is. They're scheduling transportation for the patients. They're dealing with the patient's families. There's a lot. The coordinator that's really a well-fitting name for a study coordinator, is to coordinate, because you're coordinating so many moving parts. So these are the routine visits. When the patient wants to withdraw, or when the PI wants to withdraw a patient for their safety, or when the sponsor wants to withdraw a patient for whatever reason, it's called the early termination visit. So this is a dropout for whatever reason. Documentation, super important. And there's a lot of similarities between what CRCs do and CRAs do, because CRCs generate the documentation, CRCs generate the data, and the CRAs ensure that the documentation is compliant, and the CRAs ensure that the documentation is sufficient and it meets ALCOA-C, CEA. We've done an entire podcast just on this alone as well, so check it out. But this is what makes a good CRA, is understanding what the CRC goes through. So the early termination visits, another patient visit the CRC deals with. Now, There's all kinds of other tasks. So far, we've just discussed what a coordinator does as far as patients are concerned, and maybe how they work with their investigators, the principal investigators, the sub-investigator. But they also have to file regulatory documents. They also have to maintain IRB approval. They also have to deal with their CRAs and answer queries. There's a lot. They have to make sure that there's enough supplies of investigational product, diaries, lab kits, butterfly needles, ECG electrodes, whatever the case may be. You are really a project manager. There's a lot of moving parts into being a coordinator. Regulatory, whole nother animal that CRCs have to deal with. So startup regulatory, generating the study startup documents. We've done an entire podcast on this, making sure the 1572 is up to date, making sure the GCP, the good clinical practice of all staff, are up to date, which, by the way, CRAs do all this stuff too. And what makes a happy CRA is a very diligent CRC. You're going to see why later, but if you buy the book and read the book, especially chapters 4 and 5, you're going to understand. Prep for CRA visits, and then work with the CRA on making sure that everything's up to standards with the FDA, with the protocol, and with good clinical practice. So where do the coordinators work? The coordinators work typically at the research clinic or clinics. At my site, we have a home base, which is one of our clinics. We have more space. And then we have the individual specialty clinics around town. The coordinators work at all of those places, but primarily their time is spent at the main hub, but then at the small clinics around town, depending on their schedule that day. Typically, the team consists of the coordinator, their ancillary staff if they have any assistants, their investigators that I mentioned, the site director. That's the immediate team. Obviously, they're dealing with human resources, whoever does their payroll, patient recruitment. They're dealing with certain vendors. And then, of course, they're dealing with every study that they have and the associated teams from the sponsor or from the CRO or from the IRBs of that particular study. So coordinators are truly coordinating a bunch of different moving parts. You can expect, it's not mandatory, but you can expect as a coordinator to obviously see patient visits and deal with all the visits I discussed. Also, like I said, draw blood if you want to, process lab samples if you want to. Every site's different, but at my site, they do it all. Schedule patient visits, do the startup regulatory, do the regulatory maintenance, do the closeout, be audit ready at all times. The working environment is medical setting, but it's also office, a lot of office work too. So that's the setting for coordinators. Now the skill sets and tools, the skills are obviously empathy. You need to be approachable with patients. You need to be able to understand their objections if the patients don't want to do the studies or the patients want to withdraw. Coordinators need to be empathetic. They need to be really good at multitasking. So juggling different visits. Maybe one day you're doing 2 visits from one particular protocol. The next day you're just answering queries. The next day you're doing study startup activities for another study. The next day you're doing more visits for a different study. It's just every day is kind of different for a coordinator. You have to use tools like we use CRA. Shout out to the sponsor CRA. Another one is Inato, because coordinators do help the site possibly get new studies. I have my coordinators do feasibility surveys. I have my coordinators apply for studies all the time. Inato, who's another sponsor of this podcast, has been an amazing tool for being able to get studies for my site. And then the EDC systems like Metadata, Medrio. There's a whole slew of other tools, productivity tools, like some sites use Slack, some sites use patient recruitment and retention vendors like Patient Ace that I mentioned. Some sites use project management tools like Monday. There's all kinds of tools. Understanding how to do ECGs, understanding if you're doing respiratory studies, maybe spirometers, if it's GI, understanding those kind of tests. The cool thing about research is it's never boring, because if you're always doing like different therapeutic areas, you're always learning something different. Like there's never the same type of visit if you have a multi-therapeutic clinic. If you have a specialty clinic, like let's say you only do psychiatry, then you're only going to be doing psych, obviously. But even within psych, there's such a diversity of medical conditions. There's schizophrenia, there's bipolar, there's depression, there's OCD, there's borderline, there's postpartum, there's ADHD. The list goes on. There's Tourette's. There's each of those have their own what's called gold standard for measuring the severity of a particular medical condition and the progress. You're going to learn all those things even if you don't directly do them. You're definitely going to learn what all those things are. And then, of course, all coordinators are going to be GCP certified, but also, like I mentioned, IATA certified. So the path to becoming a CRC, you don't actually need a bachelor's degree, which, unlike CRA, most of CRAs do need a bachelor's degree. I know many CRCs that have been CNAs, medical assistants, phlebotomists, like I said. You don't need a bachelor's degree. At my site, we have 4 full-time coordinators. 2 of them have bachelor's degree and 2 don't. And the 2 that don't, one is a CNA, one is a phlebotomist. And so you can become a CRC without a bachelor's degree. It's typically not an entry-level role. Even at my site, it's not, but we do hire only entry-level people, but you're not a coordinator from day one. You start out as a research assistant or a lab assistant, and then you work your way up, because it is a lot of responsibility on your plate as a coordinator. And then can you get certified as a coordinator? Yes. It's CCRC. It's optional, but it's helpful. And that's all I got to say about that. Now, the next half of this video is what are CRAs? CRAs ensure that everything I just said of what CRCs do is actually being done. I mean, we can really end the video with that, but there's a lot more that we got to get into. So just like, remember, like I said, CRAs don't have interactions with patients at all. 0. A lot of the CRAs that I know, and by the way, I have academies for both CRC Academy and CRA Academy. CRAs get paid more, typically. They get paid a lot more, maybe. Like I said to open the video, maybe twice as much, sometimes more. Although coordinators are starting to catch up lately. CRAs, we're going to get into their day-to-day, because unlike patient interaction that coordinators do almost every day, CRAs have site interactions that they do almost every single day. And there's different type of monitoring visits, and we're going to get into those. But CRAs travel a lot. The industry is trying to change a little bit of that, because the CRA burnout is insane. The CRA burnout is far worse of a problem than the CRC burnout. The CRCs typically leave a site because they need more pay. CRAs leave their work because it's just too intense. It's way too stressful. I've had CRAs in my site as a site owner crying because of the work that they, like the burden, the workload that they're given, and they just needed a place to vent. And I was there, and they kind of explained what's going on. This is par for the course. Not par for the course that you're going to cry necessarily as a CRA, but par for the course that it's a lot. And you are, part of the reason you're getting paid so much is you're being asked to sacrifice a portion of your life to travel. So you might think of these visits that we're going to get into as the main duty of the CRA, and that's true. But what you're not considering is the travel, flight delays, missing your flight, weather delays, traffic. Oh, I got to stay an extra night in this city because I didn't finish. I have to get it approved, and the sponsor doesn't want me to leave until I get through all this data. You thought you're coming home Friday. You're not coming home Friday because you got to do a monitoring visit Friday. It's crazy. Like the amount of travel these CRAs do. I would say 80% of the time they're on the road. They try to keep them regional, but they are at airports way too often, in my opinion. I couldn't do it. I've been a CRA as a contract CRA, and I chose my sites very carefully. I had 3 sites within driving distance, and I had 1 site when I was monitoring that I flew to every 4 to 6 weeks. But this was an hour-long flight. It was from Long Beach to San Francisco, so it wasn't a crazy flight. But even those, like, it takes a lot out of you. And you are getting paid, and some CRAs get paid door to door, meaning from when they leave their house to when they get back to their house, right? So it counts for all the travel time. The payment structures for CRAs differ compared to CRAs. Compared to CRCs, sorry, you can get a lot more creative with the CRA payment structure as opposed to CRC. CRCs are typically hourly or salary. CRAs are typically hourly or salary, but in between there's a lot of variation, as like I said, door to door and all that kind of stuff, because there is a lot of travel. CRAs are going to earn a lot of airline miles, a lot of car rental miles, a lot of hotel nights. So if you like all those kind of perks, you're going to get plenty of those. So let's get into the day-to-day of CRAs besides the crazy travel and the crazy schedule. You have, and I outline it all in this book as well in chapter 5, site selection visits. So you travel to potential sites to assess their capability. So I have an entire video on site selection visits, but let's say you have a study for arthritis, sponsor identified 20 sites. 4 of those sites are yours to go look at to assess whether they have the right staff, the right training, the right equipment, whether they actually exist. You're going to talk to the CRCs. You're going to talk to the PI. You're going to do your monitoring trip report. Something that coordinators don't have to do. Coordinators don't have to fill out too many reports. Actually, almost any. Coordinators do have to fill out a lot of forms, but they don't have trip reports. They have source documents to fill out. Whereas CRAs, they're not allowed to write on any source documents themselves. CRAs don't generate the source documents. CRAs monitor the source documents. But what CRAs do is where they document everything is on their trip reports. So every visit has a different trip report. Site selection visit has its own trip report. Site initiation visit, which we're going to get into now. Site initiation visits kicks off the study. You train the staff on the protocol. You document that everything is there or not there, such as IP. We have an entire 45 minutes on site initiation visits. Verify that the IP is there, the investigational product. Ensure that the staff has access to all the portals. You check the regulatory, make sure the IRB approval and all that stuff is taken care of, and you document it all in your site initiation visit trip report. And if anything's missing, those are called action items. And CRAs know you've got a long list of action items for a lot of these sites. And you're going to be working with your coordinators to ensure that the action items are being resolved in a timely manner. Interim monitoring visits is your regular routine type of monitoring visits and your most common ones. You regular check-ins with the site, so every 4 to 6 weeks. You do source data verification, where you look at the source and you look at the EDC and you make sure they line up. You do source data review, where you look at the source and you make sure, does this make sense? Is it compliant with the protocol? Is it compliant with good clinical practice? And is it compliant with the site standard operating procedures? and you verify consent forms, and you investigate IP accountability. And this is flagging deviations. This is where you are working as a CRA with your CRC. A good CRA-CRC relationship will make a study. A bad one will break a study. If you're stuck in one, like you, as a CRA, you don't get to choose who your CRCs are either. You are given a site and they have their staff. You can make recommendations to the PI if you think the coordinator is not capable. Like, hey, either you got to train this coordinator better or bring in assistants or change them out. You could make those kind of recommendations, but ultimately you don't have direct control over who your coordinator is. There's a lot of mentorship that can happen between a CRA and a CRC, however. I've done this myself. I was in both sides of this relationship. As a CRC, as a younger CRC, I was mentored by quite a few CRAs, and I'm really appreciative to them for that. This was before the age of YouTube, definitely before the age of AI. You only were able to learn through other people. Consider you guys lucky now. You have AI. You have YouTube. You're welcome, by the way. But mentorship, I was mentored as a CRC by CRAs. And later on in my career, when I became a contract CRA, I was doing a good amount of mentoring for my coordinators. And every CRA that I've interviewed on my podcast has said in some way, shape, or form, mentorship is important, and it's a way to kind of pay it forward for the industry, but also they get some satisfaction out of knowing that they are impacting the career of someone, because a lot of these coordinators go on to become CRAs one day. Closeout visit is another type of visit that the monitors have to do, where they wrap up the trial, collect the final data, reconcile all the investigational product. We've done entire videos just on closeout visits as well. Again, in this book, we go through all that stuff. Wrap up the trial. And so other tasks, review data remotely. So you're not only reviewing data when you're on site, you're reviewing data remotely. When they say that you are home-based, because now we're getting into the working environment. And on these job descriptions, you're going to see 50% home-based. That's not true. It's usually going to be 80% travel. But you are home-based. This is true. For the most part, you have a home office. Your employer, whether it's a sponsor or a CRO, is going to provide you with the computer, copy machine, scanners, all that stuff to set up your little home office. But you're not going to be home that often. You're on the road a lot. And again, you have zero interaction with patients. You interact with the coordinators that I mentioned, that hopefully you'll be mentoring some of them, with the PIs. You're also interacting with sponsors, because those are the ones who you answer to ultimately. And vendors. You might be interacting with some vendors. Now, stressful is an understatement for CRA. CRC is much more kind of chill, much more steady. CRC could get stressful too. But CRC, I feel like it has ebbs and flows of when it, like the site maybe has a period, or the particular study that the CRC is coordinating on has a particularly busy period, and then they kind of get a break for a little bit, and then it goes back to busy. CRA is just constant chaos. And this is why CRA is not entry level. And CRA is not even after 1 year of experience as a coordinator. Most coordinators need about 2 years of experience coordinating before they will be considered to be CRAs. Exceptions are made. Now, skill set and education. Bachelor's degree for the most part is required. I do know some CRAs that have no bachelor's degree, but they are basically the exceptions, not the rules. And these are people that have had 10 plus years of coordinating experience and have networked well enough to have been given the opportunities to be CRAs. But for the most part, and even them, because ultimately sponsors decide at the end of the day who their CRAs are. And even if the CRA works for a CRO, the sponsor is paying the bill, the sponsor ultimately decides. Analytical, super detail oriented. The CRA really should know the protocol better than the CRC, because the CRC typically does more studies at once than a coordinator. This is why it's kind of maybe more exciting to be a CRC, a little less boring. So let's say your average coordinator is doing anywhere from 4 to 15 studies at a time. Your average CRA is only doing like 2 or 3 studies max. Of course, there's exceptions, but so the CRAs are really the protocol experts. And then this is why there's some mentorship going on. And this is really why the industry depends on the CRAs spotting errors, because if a coordinator is busy and shifting between one study to the next every day, you need a set of eyes. And this is where AI is going to play a role, but you need a set of eyes that are well trained on one protocol. And this is that protocol expert. And they're the ones that are going to catch errors, hopefully proactively, and let the coordinators know, hey, watch out for this. This is you're headed towards a deviation here if we don't correct course. And so super analytical, very assertive, super attention to detail, clear writing, adaptability, of course. And then you're using all kinds of tools. You're probably using even more tools than sites use. And you're expected to have quick turnaround on your reports. So you have logs, you have trip reports, there's regulatory portals, just like the coordinators. You're in the EDC portal, you're in the IRB portal, you're in the IRT portal, you're in all those portals. You just have CRA access as opposed to coordinator access. So you're issuing queries rather than answering queries. GCP, you need it. And then to be certified, it's CCRA, which I think it's worth it if you're going to be a lifelong CRA. And the key differences are, again, the patient visits is coordinator only, and then the site visits are CRAs. I don't know which one's better. Don't ask me. I would prefer to be, if we take pay out of the equation, and I think most would agree with me here, they'd prefer to be coordinators if pay was equal. But pay is not equal. And many people actually enjoy traveling and being in a different city every other day. If that's you, that definitely takes a certain kind of lifestyle. I do know working moms that are CRAs. I do know working dads that are CRAs. It's possible. People do it all the time. This is why I believe you should network and connect and see how other people do it. Typically, CRA is a job many get after being a CRC. The pros and cons of both, I think I made them clear, but CRC gets patient connection and a little more work-life balance, not traveling all the time, almost ever. And CRA's higher pay, but a lot of grind. Personality, kind of the same. It used to be that CRAs were more robotic and analytical, but they have to have a good amount of empathy too, because they need the CRCs to fix whatever it is that they caught. See, the CRAs can't do it on their own. They're not allowed to touch the data. So they have to convince and influence the CRCs. And sometimes these CRCs are so overworked and there's a lot of turnover because they're at an academic medical center maybe. So they just are trained to pass the buck to the next coordinator. And you've got a CRA that has a list of action items that's ever growing. And then they're getting pressure from the sponsor. And maybe the sponsor is now thinking, why is this CRA not able to influence the site? There's pros and cons to both. If you like this, I really appreciate it. Hopefully it gives you some clarity as to the differences between the two. They're confused all the time, and to make it matters worse, some roles even at sites call the employees clinical research associates, even though they're site workers. This typically happens at academic medical centers. But patient interaction coordinator, interacting strictly with sites, CRAs. Hopefully this helps. Drop a like, drop a comment, drop a subscribe. Hope you share. Catch you all later. Bye-bye.
Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.